The morning of October 25, 1944 brought with it the kind of gray silence that settles over the Philippine Sea like a burial shroud. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the destroyer Nowaki as she cut through the choppy waters east of Samar Island. The 31st Destroyer Division had been assigned screening duty for Admiral Kurita's center force during what Imperial Navy planners called Operation Sho-Go. The plan was simple enough on paper. Four separate Japanese task forces would converge on Leyte Gulf and destroy the American invasion fleet anchored there. Yamamoto had served aboard destroyers for 8 years since graduating from the Naval Academy at Iwo. He had witnessed the Pearl Harbor attack from the deck of the destroyer Akigumo. He had fought through the desperate battles of the Solomons where so many of his classmates had died. He had survived the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot where American fighter pilots had torn through Japanese air formations like wolves through sheep. Now at age 28, he commanded his own ship in what everyone knew would be the Imperial Navy's final desperate gamble. The Nowaki was a Ugyur-class destroyer displacing 2,500 tons and armed with 6 5-inch guns in 3 twin turrets. Her crew of 240 sailors had trained together for 2 years. They knew every rivet and bolt of their ship. They could load and fire the main guns in complete darkness. They could launch torpedoes by feel alone. But what they faced in the waters off Samar would test them beyond anything their training had prepared them for. At 0545 hours, the lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon to the northeast. Yamamoto raised his binoculars and studied the distant plumes. American ships. Lots of them. The center force had found its target. Admiral Kurita's heavy cruisers and battleships would make short work of the invasion transports anchored in Leyte Gulf. The destroyers would screen the capital ships and finish off any cripples trying to escape. What Yamamoto did not know was that the American ships his lookouts had spotted were not helpless transports. They were the escort carriers of Taffy III under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. 6 light carriers defended by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. 17 ships total against Admiral Kurita's force of 23 vessels, including 4 battleships and 8 heavy cruisers. The first indication that something had gone wrong came at 0658 hours when the heavy cruiser Kumano opened fire on what her gunnery officer had identified as an American cruiser. The shells landed close enough to the carrier Fanshawe Bay to drench her flight deck with colored spray from the dye markers. Within minutes, every Japanese ship in the center force was firing at the fleeing American carriers. Yamamoto watched through his binoculars as the American ships turned east and began laying smoke. Standard procedure. Run away and call for help. The Imperial Navy had faced this tactic countless times before. Heavy ships would pound the enemy at long range while destroyers moved in for torpedo attacks. It should have been a massacre. But the Americans did something unexpected. Instead of simply running away, the escort carriers began launching aircraft. Yamamoto could see the tiny planes lifting off from the carrier decks even as 14-inch shells from the battleship Yamato straddled the ships. More surprising still was the behavior of the American destroyers. Rather than staying close to their charges for protection, they were turning toward the Japanese formation. Tacking. The destroyer USS Johnston was the first to charge into gun range of the center force. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, had served in the Pacific since the war began. He understood that the only way to save the carriers was to disrupt the Japanese attack, even if it meant sacrificing his own ship. At 0700 hours, Johnston opened fire with her 5 5-inch guns on the heavy cruiser Kumano from a range of 18,000 yards. Yamamoto watched in disbelief as the lone American destroyer raced toward the entire Japanese formation, firing rapidly. Her guns were puny compared to the 8-inch and 14-inch weapons trained on her, but she kept firing. Within minutes, she had landed several hits on Kumano's superstructure and knocked out one of the cruiser's gun turrets. More importantly, she was forcing the Japanese heavy ships to divide their attention between the fleeing carriers and the attacking destroyer. The Nowaki received orders to close with the American destroyer and finish her off. Yamamoto rang up flank speed and turned to intercept. The range closed rapidly as both ships charged toward each other at a combined speed of over 60 knots. At 10,000 yards, Johnston launched a spread of 10 torpedoes, then turned hard to port to unmask her rear guns. The torpedo tracks were clearly visible in the morning light. Yamamoto ordered hard right rudder and the Nowaki heeled over sharply as she turned to parallel the torpedo tracks. The deadly fish passed down the starboard side so close that the crew could see their wakes. One torpedo passed less than 10 feet from the hull. But Johnston was not finished. As soon as her torpedo launch was complete, she turned back toward the Japanese formation and resumed firing. Her gunnery was remarkably accurate for a ship maneuvering at high speed. Shell splashes walked up and down the length of the heavy cruiser Suzuya, forcing her to turn away to avoid damage. More American destroyers were joining the attack. The USS Hull was charging in from the northeast while the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was approaching from the south. These were not large ships. The Roberts displaced only 1350 tons and carried just two 5-inch guns. But they were attacking with a ferocity that stunned the Japanese commanders. Yamamoto found himself in the strange position of having his 2,500-ton destroyer being attacked by a ship half her size. The Samuel B. Roberts was firing as fast as her guns could cycle. Her shells were landing close enough to Nowaki to send fragments whistling across the deck. Yamamoto ordered his gunners to concentrate on the plucky little ship, but she was twisting and turning like a mad thing, making her a difficult target. The American destroyers were using a new tactic that Imperial Navy intelligence had not anticipated. Instead of operating independently, they were coordinating their attacks like a wolf pack. While Johnston drew fire from the heavy ships, the other destroyers launched torpedo attacks from different angles. When the Japanese formation turned to avoid one set of torpedoes, they exposed themselves to attacks from another direction. At 0730 hours, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts scored a remarkable hit on the heavy cruiser Chikuma. The 5-inch shell penetrated the cruiser's thin deck armor and exploded in her engine room. Chikuma began losing speed and billowing black smoke. A 1350-ton destroyer escort had just mission-killed an 11,000-ton heavy cruiser. Yamamoto was beginning to understand what made the American destroyer tactics so effective. It was not just their weapons or their seamanship. It was their willingness to sacrifice themselves for their mission. Japanese destroyers were trained to preserve themselves for the decisive battle. These American ships were throwing themselves at the enemy with no thought of survival. The destroyer USS Hull was demonstrating this philosophy in the most dramatic way possible. She had already taken multiple hits from Japanese heavy guns but continued attacking. Her forward gun mount had been knocked out. Her bridge was shot away. She was listing heavily to port and down by the bow. But her surviving guns continued firing. At 0745 hours, the Nowaki finally landed a decisive hit on the Samuel B. Roberts. The 5-inch shell struck the destroyer escort's magazine and detonated her forward ammunition storage. The explosion lifted the entire bow section of the ship into the air before it crashed back down, twisted and torn. Roberts began sinking by the head, but her stern guns continued firing until she slipped beneath the waves at 0810 hours. But the sacrifice of the American destroyers had accomplished their mission. The escort carriers had escaped to the east while their protectors held off the entire center force. More importantly, the destroyers had bought time for aircraft from other American carriers to arrive over the battlefield. Yamamoto first became aware of the new threat when his radar operator reported multiple contacts approaching from the southeast. American carrier aircraft. Lots of them. The Nowaki's 25mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the first wave of torpedo bombers swept in low over the water. The American aircraft were different from the ones Yamamoto had faced earlier in the war. These pilots were better trained and their tactics more sophisticated. Instead of attacking piecemeal, they coordinated their strikes. Dive bombers attacked from high altitude to suppress anti-aircraft fire, while torpedo bombers came in at wave top level from multiple directions. The heavy cruiser Suzuya was the first Japanese ship to fall victim to the coordinated air attacks. A 1,000-pound bomb from an SB-2C Helldiver penetrated her deck armor and exploded in her machinery spaces. She began losing speed immediately. Torpedo bombers from the carrier Kitkun Bay finished her off with 2 aerial torpedoes amidships. Suzuya capsized and sank within 20 minutes, taking most of her crew with her. But it was the behavior of the American aircraft that most surprised Yamamoto. When they ran out of bombs and torpedoes, they continued attacking with machine guns. When they ran out of ammunition, they made dry runs over Japanese ships, forcing them to maneuver and break formation. Some pilots even threw empty beer bottles and coffee cups at Japanese ships when they had nothing else left. The destroyer Nowaki found herself under constant air attack for the next hour. Yamamoto's anti-aircraft gunners shot down 3 American planes, but more kept coming. Near misses from bombs opened seams in the hull. Machine gun fire swept the decks, killing and wounding his sailors. But the ship remained afloat and operational. At 0900 hours, Admiral Kurita made the fateful decision to withdraw the center force. The American destroyer attacks had disrupted his formation and scattered his ships across miles of ocean. Constant air attacks were wearing down his crews and damaging his ships. Most critically, he had lost contact with the other Japanese task forces that were supposed to coordinate the attack on Leyte Gulf. Yamamoto received the withdrawal order with mixed emotions. His ship had survived, but the mission had failed. More than that, the Americans had demonstrated new tactics that rendered traditional Japanese naval doctrine obsolete. Small ships working together could defeat much larger individual vessels. Aircraft and surface ships could coordinate their attacks in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. The withdrawal from Samar became a running battle as American aircraft pursued the Japanese formation. The destroyer Nowaki was attacked repeatedly, but her experienced crew managed to avoid serious damage through skillful maneuvering. Other ships were not so fortunate. The heavy cruiser Chikuma, which had been damaged earlier by the Samuel B. Roberts, was finished off by air attacks at 1030 hours. As the center force limped westward through the sea beyond sea, Yamamoto had time to reflect on what he had witnessed. The Americans had not won through superior numbers or better weapons. They had won through superior tactics and unmatched courage. Their destroyer crews had sacrificed themselves without hesitation to protect the carriers. Their aircraft pilots had continued attacking even when they had no weapons left. But most importantly, the Americans had demonstrated something the Imperial Navy had forgotten. Modern naval warfare was not about individual ship duels or even single battles. It was about coordinated operations where different types of ships and aircraft worked together as a unified force. The Americans called it combined arms warfare, and they had perfected it to a degree that rendered traditional naval tactics obsolete. The destroyer USS Johnston, which had led the American attack, finally succumbed to her damage at 0945 hours. She had taken over 40 hits from Japanese guns but continued fighting until her magazines were empty and her engines failed. As she slipped beneath the waves, her crew was rescued by other American ships that risked their own safety to save their comrades. This was perhaps the most shocking revelation for Yamamoto. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized death before dishonor. Sailors were expected to go down with their ships rather than be captured. But the Americans made extraordinary efforts to rescue survivors even in the middle of battle. They valued the lives of their sailors more than abstract concepts of honor. The battle off Samar Island lasted less than 3 hours, but its implications would reshape naval warfare forever. A handful of American destroyers and destroyer escorts had turned back the most powerful surface force the Imperial Navy could assemble. They had done it not through superior firepower but through superior tactics, teamwork, and raw courage. The destroyer Nowaki reached the safety of Coron Bay in the Philippines late on October 25. Of the 23 ships that had set out with the center force, 21 returned. But they had accomplished nothing. The American invasion of Leyte continued uninterrupted. The Imperial Navy had shot its bolt and failed to hit its target. Over the following weeks, Yamamoto learned more details about the American destroyer tactics through intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations. The Americans called their ships wolf packs because they hunted in coordinated groups like wolves, attacking prey much larger than themselves. Each ship had a specific role in the attack pattern. Some drew fire while others launched torpedoes. Some laid smoke screens while others spotted for the carriers. But the most revolutionary aspect of American destroyer tactics was their use of radar. Each ship carried multiple radar sets that allowed them to track targets and coordinate attacks, even in darkness or bad weather. The radar information was shared between ships using new radio equipment that allowed near-instantaneous communication. This radar network turned each destroyer into part of a larger sensing and striking system. A single destroyer could call in air strikes from carriers hundreds of miles away. Multiple destroyers could coordinate their attacks with precision impossible using only visual observation. The Americans had essentially created a naval version of the human nervous system with radar as the eyes and radio as the nerves. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized individual ship excellence. Each captain was expected to use his own judgment and initiative to support the overall mission. This had worked well in the early years of the war when Japanese crews were more experienced than their opponents. But it proved inadequate when facing an enemy that could coordinate the actions of dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft in real time. The destruction of the Samuel B. Roberts particularly affected Yamamoto. The little destroyer escort had fought like a battleship against impossible odds. Her crew knew they were doomed but continued fighting until their ship was literally blown apart beneath them. This was not the reckless bravery that Japanese culture celebrated. This was something different. Calculated courage in service of a clearly defined mission. American destroyer crews had been trained to view their ships as expendable tools rather than sacred vessels. If sacrificing a destroyer could save a carrier, then the destroyer would be sacrificed without hesitation. This utilitarian approach to naval warfare shocked Japanese officers who had been raised to view their ships as extensions of their own souls. But the Americans did not throw away their ships carelessly. Every sacrifice was calculated to achieve maximum strategic benefit. The destroyers at Samar had not died in vain. Their sacrifice saved the escort carriers, which in turn saved the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. One successful kamikaze attack might kill a few hundred Americans. One failed naval operation might cost Japan the war. The battle off Samar also demonstrated the effectiveness of American damage control techniques. Japanese ships that took serious hits usually sank quickly. American ships seemed capable of absorbing tremendous punishment and remaining operational. The destroyer Johnston took over 40 hits from guns ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch but remained afloat for nearly 3 hours. This survivability was the result of extensive training and superior damage control equipment. American ships carried more pumps, firefighting equipment, and repair materials than their Japanese counterparts. More importantly, American crews were trained to contain damage rather than simply abandon ship when things got bad. Japanese naval culture discouraged initiative among lower-ranking personnel. Damage control parties waited for orders from officers who might be dead or incapacitated. American damage control parties were trained to act independently. Petty officers and even ordinary seamen were authorized to flood compartments or jettison equipment if they thought it would save the ship. The October 25th battle also highlighted the growing disparity in pilot quality between the two navies. American carrier pilots attacking the center force demonstrated superior training and tactics. They coordinated their attacks effectively and pressed home their strikes despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. Many of the pilots had been flying combat missions for over a year, and their experience showed. Japanese pilot quality had declined dramatically since the beginning of the war. The experienced aviators who had made the Pearl Harbor attack were mostly dead. Their replacements received abbreviated training and limited flight time due to fuel shortages. Many had never made a carrier landing before their first combat mission. But even more significant than pilot quality was the difference in aircraft availability. American carriers could launch strike after strike because they had large numbers of aircraft and experienced maintenance crews. Japanese carriers that survived long enough to launch their aircraft usually could not recover them due to flight deck damage or lack of fuel. The Americans had also developed new aircraft specifically designed for the naval war in the Pacific. The F-6F Hellcat fighter was superior to anything in the Japanese inventory. The SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber could carry a 1,000-pound bomb load over considerable distances. The TBF Avenger torpedo bomber was fast enough to survive interception and heavily armored enough to absorb significant damage. Japanese aircraft design had stagnated during the war. The Zero fighter that had dominated early Pacific battles was now obsolete. New designs like the George and Jack fighters were too little too late. More critically, Japanese industry could not produce aircraft fast enough to replace combat losses. The destroyer Nowaki remained in Philippine waters until December 1944, when she was transferred back to Japanese home waters. By then, the strategic situation had become hopeless. American B-29 bombers were pounding Japanese cities. The submarine blockade had reduced imports to a trickle. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. Yamamoto spent his final months of the war training new destroyer crews at the naval base in Kure. Most of his students were teenagers with only basic seamanship training. They would never have the opportunity to apply their skills in combat. The Imperial Navy was saving its remaining ships for the final battle to defend the home islands. That battle never came. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over radio. The war was over. The destroyer Nowaki was turned over to Allied occupation forces and eventually scrapped. Her crew was demobilized and sent home to help rebuild their shattered country. Yamamoto survived the war and eventually became a merchant marine officer. He spent the rest of his career sailing the same waters where he had once fought American destroyers. In his later years, he often reflected on the lessons learned during that brief battle off Samar Island. The Americans had won through superior organization training and tactics rather than simply throwing more ships at the problem. They had demonstrated that modern warfare required coordination between different types of forces. Most importantly, they had shown that protecting your own forces was just as important as destroying the enemy. These lessons were not lost on post-war naval planners. The radar picket destroyer concepts pioneered by the Americans during World War II evolved into the sophisticated air defense systems used by modern navies. The wolf pack tactics used at Samar became the foundation for contemporary naval strike group operations. But the most enduring legacy of the battle off Samar was the demonstration that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The American destroyer crews who charged into gun range of Japanese battleships knew they were probably going to die. They attacked anyway because their mission required it. This same spirit would carry American forces through the Cold War and beyond. From the destroyer escorts attacking Japanese battleships to the guided missile cruisers protecting carrier battle groups, the fundamental principle remained the same. Success in naval warfare required ships and crews willing to sacrifice themselves for the larger mission. The Japanese learned these lessons too, though it took a devastating defeat to teach them. Post-war Japanese maritime self-defense force doctrine emphasized coordination between different types of ships and aircraft. They adopted American-style damage control techniques and radar networking systems. Most importantly, they learned to value the lives of their sailors. Modern Japanese naval vessels carry extensive medical facilities and rescue equipment. Crews are trained to save their ships when possible but to save themselves when necessary. The abstract concepts of honor that had motivated Imperial Navy crews were replaced by more practical considerations. The battle off Samar Island lasted only 2 hours and 47 minutes from first contact to Japanese withdrawal. In that brief time, 1474 American sailors gave their lives to protect the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Their sacrifice saved thousands of other American lives and hastened the end of the war. More than the lives saved or strategic objectives achieved, the battle demonstrated the power of new naval warfare concepts. Small ships working together could defeat much larger individual vessels. Radar and radio communications could multiply the effectiveness of naval forces. Aircraft and surface ships could coordinate their attacks in ways that previous generations of naval officers had never imagined. These innovations would reshape naval warfare for decades to come. The destroyer wolf pack tactics pioneered at Samar evolved into the hunter-killer groups that dominated anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War. The radar picket concepts became the foundation for modern fleet air defense systems. The coordination between surface ships and aircraft became standard operating procedure for all major navies. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the human element in warfare. Superior technology and tactics meant nothing without crews willing to use them effectively. The American destroyer crews at Samar had demonstrated that ordinary sailors could achieve extraordinary things when properly trained and motivated. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto returned to civilian life but never forgot what he had witnessed on October 25, 1944. In his post-war writings, he described the battle as a perfect example of how modern warfare had evolved beyond individual heroics to become a contest between entire technological and organizational systems. The Americans had not won because their ships were bigger or their guns more powerful. They had won because they had developed better ways to coordinate the actions of multiple ships and aircraft. They had created a naval warfare system that was greater than the sum of its parts. This systemic approach to warfare would dominate military thinking for the rest of the 20th century. From the destroyer wolf packs at Samar to the carrier battle groups of the Cold War, American naval doctrine emphasized coordination between different types of forces. Individual ships were important only as components of larger operational systems. The Japanese learned this lesson the hard way, but they learned it thoroughly. By the 1970s, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force had become one of the most technologically advanced navies in the world. Their ships carried the latest radar and sonar systems. Their crews trained constantly in coordinated operations with American and other allied forces. But they never forgot the cost of their earlier failures. Every Japanese naval officer studied the battle off Samar as an example of what happened when superior numbers and individual ship excellence were not enough to overcome superior tactics and coordination. The destroyer Nowaki and her sister ships had been technically superior to their American opponents, but they had been defeated by an enemy that fought smarter rather than harder. The wreck of the destroyer USS Johnston was located in 2019 at a depth of over 20,000 feet in the Philippine Sea. Her discovery renewed interest in the battle off Samar and the courage of her crew. The ship that had charged into gun range of Japanese battleships was finally given the recognition she deserved. Modern naval officers from around the world study the Johnston's attack as a perfect example of how determination and superior tactics can overcome numerical disadvantage. Her crew's willingness to sacrifice themselves for their mission remains an inspiration to naval personnel everywhere. The battle off Samar Island marked the end of one era in naval warfare and the beginning of another. The days when battleships could settle naval battles through long-range gunnery duels were over. The future belonged to coordinated forces that could combine the capabilities of surface ships, submarines, and aircraft into unified striking systems. The American destroyer crews who fought and died off Samar Island could not have known that they were pioneering tactics that would dominate naval warfare for decades to come. They were simply doing their duty as they understood it. But their sacrifice and their example helped establish principles that continue to guide naval operations around the world. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto lived until 1987 and saw the development of modern naval warfare systems that would have seemed like science fiction during World War II. Ships guided by satellites, missiles that could strike targets hundreds of miles away, computers that could coordinate the actions of entire fleets. But the fundamental principles established off Samar Island remained unchanged. Success in naval warfare still required coordination between different types of forces. It still demanded crews willing to sacrifice themselves for the larger mission. And it still rewarded the Navy that could fight smarter rather than simply fighting harder. The destroyer wolf packs that stunned the Imperial Navy at Samar had established the template for all future naval operations. The lesson was clear and enduring. In modern warfare, individual excellence was not enough. Victory belonged to the force that could best coordinate its various components into a unified system. The American destroyer crews at Samar had demonstrated this principle with their blood and their lives. Their sacrifice had changed naval warfare forever.